Yuval, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't we start off with your background, where you started off, arc of your career, what you're doing now?
Well, I'm an immigrant to the United States. I was born in Israel. My family came to the U.S. when I was a child, and I grew up in New Jersey. And I guess I would describe myself these days as a recovering political scientist. I have a PhD from the University of Chicago in political theory, but have spent the last 20 years working in public policy in one way or another, in government first, as a congressional staffer and a White House staffer in the Bush administration, and now for more than a decade as a think tank scholar. And I'm now director of social, cultural, and constitutional studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And I'm the editor of a quarterly policy journal called National Affairs.
And so why did you leave the government and go into think tankery? Was there some motivation for that? And or do you have an eye to return at some point?
Well, my interest has always been, I would say, at the intersection of theory and practice in public policy. That space where the ideas that you might study as an academic looking at political theory intersect with how government actually works and how our politics functions. I learned an enormous amount on that front in government, and found it very valuable and interesting. But after a while, I wanted to turn toward something more like research and writing, and so this has given me a chance to write books, to write essays and articles, and it's the place where I do the kind of work that I think I can bring the most to.
So in terms of the broad themes of that academic interest, and you have several books over the years that maybe capture some of those, but can you explain, just generally speaking, what is it that is interesting to you, and the broad research programs that you're working on?
I'm interested in the ideas that underlie some of our familiar political and policy debates, and I would say one recurring theme of my work is the source of the divisions between left and right in modern liberal democracy. I wrote a book about the roots of some of those in late 18th century debates between Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine. I wrote a book about the ways they manifest in science and technology debates. And I've written now a couple of books about the ways in which our political culture is broken down, and how both growing partisanship and polarization on the one hand, and the kind of fragmentation and increasing alienation in American life has made it hard for our political system to function. I would say I'm interested in political culture and its effect on institutions. And so that just naturally happens at that intersection of theory and practice, and it's where most of my work has been directed.
And so specifically, if we talk on party, I think you're known as having some insights into the role of party and what's been happening with party recently. But if we take the concept of party and we look at Congress as an institution, right? The founders didn't really conceive of parties when they designed the Constitution. But as you've mentioned, they formed right away, or someone has mentioned, I should say, they formed right away afterwards. What is your perspective on what the appropriate role for parties are in Congress? Can you talk us through that a little bit, maybe over time historically, and then, today, if you think there's anything special about the environment today for parties?
Well, I think broadly speaking, our politics divided into not just parties, but two parties almost immediately after the ratification of the Constitution. They haven't been quite the same two parties, but more or less. And when we've had more than two, it's only lasted a short time until the system fell back into two. And I think that speaks of a certain kind of fundamental division that exists also in multi-party systems, but is especially expressed in ours. I would say some of the divisions that happen between parties in the European democracies happen within parties in the American system. And our parties are really they're sources of political professionalism in a system that is otherwise largely the terrain of amateurs. That is, what the parties do is select candidates and define issues in ways that then allow our politics to proceed in a democratic fashion. And the parties function best when they're able to play that role, when they define and shape the political arena They haven't been playing that role very well now for, I would say, at least 2 generations in American life, because of some reforms that were undertaken for understandable reasons, reforms of the election system, especially the introduction of the primary system in the 70s, reforms of campaign finance, all intended to empower the broader public over special interests, but I think ultimately rooted in some misunderstandings about what parties are and what they do. And we're in a situation now where the role that parties ought to play, candidate selection, recruitment, and a kind of broadening of the tent, forming groups of politicians into broad national coalitions, isn't really happening. And some of that work, because it isn't happening in the parties, has had to happen in Congress. And, the US Congress is not really built to function that way. It is ultimately an arena for contention and accommodation, bargaining and compromise, and expecting it instead to be a forum for the working out of an increasingly polarized partisanship has not been good for the Congress. And I think it's played out in some ways that have undermined the work of the legislature.
And what about this concept of the parties, having sort of embedded their own rules into Congress itself, right? I mean, you have this concept of the minority leader or the majority leader. I mean, those are not official titles set up. They're manufactured by the parties themselves over time. There's the speaker has really become the majority leader. We talked to Mickey Edwards, Representative Mickey Edwards, a few weeks back, and he's gone rogue. He's totally against the party idea at this point, having any kind of structural influence in Congress. And I wonder, from your perspective, having thought through the value that parties can bring, why do these structured rules exist in Congress that kind of ensconce the parties as legitimate institutions within Congress? And are those necessary, or are they impediments to the kind of compromise you're talking about?
Yeah, these offices of majority leader, minority leader are not new. They've existed almost as long as the Congress has. And that's been the case because, again, it's very hard to avoid parties and partisanship in a system like ours. What is new is the centralization of power in those offices. So that rather than serve as an arena where coalitions form in an ad hoc way around issues and around legislative ideas, Congress has become an arena where 2 coalitions confront each other all the time. I think that has happened in part because of the broader polarization of the larger society outside of Congress, but in part also because of the centralization of power in the Speaker in the House and in the Majority Leader in the Senate, in such a way that it's now much harder for internal factions to form within the parties. Throughout most of American history, if you looked at Congress, you would have found that although there are just 2 parties, there are actually 4 or 6 or 8 recognizable factions within Congress. Sometimes these were regional, which wasn't always great. I mean, that leads to a kind of polarization too. But sometimes most times there were a combination of regional and ideological. Northeastern Republicans were easy to distinguish from Southern Republicans and Western Republicans. Urban Democrats and rural Democrats were distinct. They were quite different. And these groups negotiated with each other across party lines as well as within parties. And Congress could function as an arena for coalition bargaining in that way. Over the last 25 years, maybe a little more, Congress has centralized power very intensely along partisan lines. And now it is more difficult, not impossible, it still happens, but more difficult for intra-party factions to form. So that I think that when we think about reforms of the Congress, one goal to aim at is to enable greater factionalization within the parties so that the 2-party coalitions are not quite as rigid as they have become. I don't think you get away from parties, and I don't think you get away from majority leaders and from the Speaker being essentially a partisan role. That is as old as the Congress now. But I think you can get to a point where power is more decentralized, particularly through the committee system, and therefore where strange coalitions can form. The kind of thing that's happening now around an infrastructure bill, where some Republicans working with some Democrats are doing something that's pretty disappointing to many other Republicans and other Democrats, is how Congress has generally functioned. And I think it is worth thinking about how that can be recovered, because that allows Congress to operate in a way that pushes against the intense polarization of our larger politics rather than playing into it.
What about this concept of, the majority or the minority leader being able to control the members within their own party through, promotion, chairmanships, X, Y, and Z? I mean, that's the reason that they vote in line, or is it not? I guess that's really my question.
I think at this point, it really isn't. Members don't value committee assignments the way they once did. They're not known by what committee they're on, and they don't think of their career advancement that way. Members are now independent operators to a very extraordinary degree. And ironically, that independence has actually empowered centralized leaders. The absence of a middle level of committee work that matters to the members and matters to the leadership has meant that leaders have more power and members are more independent at the same time. And it has also meant that Congress is not functioning very well. So the party leadership has always had a fair amount of power over committee assignments and over who gets what kind of power in Congress, and that has always been a way to demand a certain kind of party fealty and obedience. Obviously, there's a downside to that; it's a problem. But I would argue that actually the situation we face now looks more like a shortage of that than an excess of that. The reason that members stick together is not so much that their leaders have a huge amount of leverage over them because of committee assignments. There is some leverage that leaders exercise in terms of fundraising, of helping them have the money they need to run. But frankly, members are polarized because the larger society is polarized. And we have to think about how Congress can function in a way that pushes against that creates incentives for cross-partisan accommodation and coalition building. It seems to me that some degree of decentralization would help there, but less because party leaders have power within the institution than because there have to be some institutional forces that push against the kind of polarization that our political culture imposes on everybody now.
And it sounds like instead of, weakening the chairman's or the speaker's ability to dole out committee assignments, a better way would be just to empower the committee chairs would be a better way to affect that kind of change. Is that right?
I think so. Things like allowing committees to control some floor time, for example. I'll put it this way: a lot of members, especially in the House, but to some degree in the Senate too, couldn't really tell you why they should spend time on committee work. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't end up being very valuable. It doesn't lead to legislation with their name on it. They need something to show back home. And if they can't show legislation, then they're going to show clips of themselves on their favorite cable news channel complaining about the other side. They got to show something. And the way things now work, committee work just doesn't really get anywhere. Major bills move by party leaders talking to each other in private and writing a bill that members don't see until 2 days before they have to vote on them. Changing that so that some of the incentives that confront members drive them in the direction of doing legislative work with one another, which is what the committee system could do, I think is enormously important. Congress could learn a lot from the state legislatures on this front. And a fair number of state legislatures now allow committees to control floor time. So a bill that makes it through committee has some guarantee that it will be considered by the larger body. Maybe it won't pass, but it'll get time on the floor. Right now, nobody gets time on the floor except the speaker and the majority leader. That's it. They control everything that happens. And so there's no point in devoting yourself to committee work. Members are not wrong to treat this as unimportant. It actually is unimportant at the moment. Right.
So I guess that leads us to another kind of discussion point that you've talked about in the past, which is, if there were to be some discussion between the majority and the minority, what form would it take, right? I think there's the notion of bargaining you've brought up, and then there's some other ways that people can get together. But can you take us through that idea? How should the minority and the majority be talking, be engage with each other in Congress? And should it be in committee versus, the floor, what have you?
I think it's a wonderful question. And it's a very important question because oftentimes, I'd put it this way, we have a lot of agreement over the notion that there's something wrong with Congress. I actually think we have less agreement than we think about what's wrong with Congress and what would a Congress that is more functional look like. There are some people who would argue that a more functional Congress looks like a European Parliament, where the majority party gets to run things for however long the voters let it run things. And however narrow its majority, it's in charge. And that means that until it gets thrown out of power, it can do what it wants. Another vision of how Congress works, I would say a more Madisonian vision of how Congress works, is that cross-partisan agreement is essential for any real action to happen. And Congress is the arena where the two broad parties that define American political life have to deal with each other. They are given no choice but to deal with each other. I am very much in that latter camp. I think Congress is not a European Parliament. It should not be narrowly majoritarian. And it should be a place where the two parties have to deal with each other and have to find ways to somehow bargain, accommodate, negotiate so that legislation can move. So that means, for example, that I'm protective of the filibuster in the Senate and other kinds of counter-majoritarian mechanisms in both houses that force some accommodation. We're in a moment now, for example, where we have the narrowest congressional majority in my lifetime. A majority party that has 50 Senate seats and is in power because of the vice president and has less than 51% of the House. It should be obvious to that party that it has to negotiate with the other party, but it is not obvious. And it's not obvious to either one of them that that's what needs to happen now. I think what the interaction between them should look like is negotiation and bargaining. Now, there has to be some persuasion too, right? They're ultimately trying to improve the country, and it matters that they make a case to each other about what's good for the country, not just about what I want and what you want. But we also have to accept the fact that these are sophisticated adults who have spent their lives in politics. They're not just going to be persuaded to change their mind about big issues on the floor of the Senate. That's not going to happen. What could happen is a kind of bargaining that involves one side laying out its priorities, the other side laying out its priorities, and the two of them finding a way for each to achieve something significant. That traditionally is how our legislatures have worked, and I think it needs to be how Congress works. It doesn't come that naturally now to a lot of members. When you see examples of it, like bargaining over an infrastructure bill in the Senate, it's taken to be this kind of weird thing where, members are working around the usual forms of the institution. I think that's what the institution's work should look like. Coalitions forming around issues and bargaining with each other to arrive at legislation.
So when you use the word bargaining, what in reality are we talking about? Are we talking about, I'll give you a bridge if you give me an airport, or is it, you vote for my bill and I'll vote for your bill? When you say bargaining, what are the actual things we're talking about?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. I think sometimes around the formation of legislation, it really does have to look like, this is something I want very much, and in return for that, I'm willing to give you something that you want. That's generally what legislative bargaining looks like. It's worth our recognizing that that kind of process actually requires some preconditions that are not well met by the contemporary Congress. For example, it requires some privacy for negotiation. There's not a lot of that in Congress now. Congress is very transparent, again, for understandable reasons, but there are cameras in every committee room, not only on the floor, and it's very hard for members to talk to each other without having to put on a television show. And bargaining in public is very hard. Expecting Congress to do that, I think, is unreasonable. There's a reason why so much actual legislation happens outside the bounds of that system, in the leadership offices, at midnight before a government shutdown, or you see the formation of these kinds of groups, the gang of 9, the gang of 12, or these 20 members working on infrastructure. 20 members working on infrastructure kind of sounds to me like a committee, right? That's what the congressional committees are supposed to be. 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats, they're bargaining over a particular policy issue. But these members feel like they have to do that outside of the framework of the committee system, because that framework does not actually give them the right environment to do that kind of work. So I think both in terms of reaching an agreement that says, I'll vote for this if you vote for that, and in terms of this bill should include some of what I want, some of what you want, if it's going to get both our votes, all of that requires an approach to legislative work that is less performative, that sees itself less as putting on a kind of culture war entertainment, and that instead understands itself as in the business of negotiating. That's just what Congress is for. You know, members who want to put on a show, there are other ways to do that. You can get a show on Fox News. That's fine. But the actual work of Congress needs to look much more like old-fashioned legislative bargaining, because there isn't actually anywhere else in our political system for not only the parties, but the kind of factions and interests and coalitions within the parties to talk to each other and work things out. It can't happen in the courts. That's not what they're for. The president is one person and can't speak for these different interests. This is what Congress is for, and it's the reason why Congress is at the center of our system of government. So I think we have to recover some of that.
So what you're describing really sounds like a kind of a market, right? I mean, you could almost formalize it into a trading market of some kind. Now, let's go to the other part of it, which is, you know, actual convincing someone of something, you know, changing someone's mind, right? When we talk about, and again, I come from a science background where that's what it's all about. You know, you're using data that either comport with theories or they don't. And if they don't, you know, people have to reject the theories and adopt new ones, right? One would presume that this process could be possible in the Congress. You know, can you talk to me a little bit about that? What do you think gives you hope that such a thing is possible, and what says that it's not?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. I think that kind of persuasion happens much more now within the party coalitions than between them. The different factions of the Democratic Party absolutely do persuade one another of things, and not in a cynical way. They actually do. You know, politicians who come into politics as you know, from the kind of left wing of the Progressive Coalition, but by encountering Southern Democrats or others who have a different view on crime or on economics, they actually really can come to change their views. I've seen this happen in the Republican Party. I'm a Republican, where a lot of people in public life on the right have come over time to, I would say, if you think of the right as consisting of social conservatives and economic conservatives, each of those has become much more like the other over the last 20 years. And it's not just as a result of political pressure and the strength of the coalition. People have actually become persuaded. Social conservatives who think that markets work, fiscal conservatives who have come to understand why there's a concern about culture, for example. That does happen. I've certainly seen people become persuaded of things. It's much more rare for it to happen across party lines now. And part of that is the concern that everything you do is public, is on television. For a member of Congress to sort of be seen becoming persuaded by the other side on an issue that's significant to his or her voters, you know, it's a risk they try not to run. It's unfortunate, but I don't know how many people have ever been really persuaded of very much on the floor of the House or Senate. Right. Again, that happens in more private settings, in conversations with each other. I certainly do think that more time spent together could help people understand each other better. But in my experience, I've seen that happen much more within the parties than between them.
And you think that's mainly in part due to the private nature of inter-party, or the private nature of intra-party discussions versus between the parties? I think that's part of
it, and also just the polarization of our broader political culture, where it's just harder now for a politician to say, you know, I'm a Republican, but on these questions of race, I just completely understand what the left is saying, and I agree with them. I think there are plenty of Republicans who might believe that. There are very few who want to be out there saying that. And the incentives are not there for them to be seen to be persuaded.
Well, so let's move on then to this concept of incentives. You've given that area a lot of thought. And, you know, when you look at any individual member, House member or senator, you know, there's so many incentives you could list there. very, at the bottom is, for the country, to make it a better country. You've got re-election, and a lot of scholars, they make a whole career of trying to figure out which incentives are responsible for which legislation. None of them often are very noble. So can you talk me through your perspective on incentives, and where they are now, how they've evolved, and how they need to change?
Yeah, I tend to put the most cynical kinds of economic and even electoral incentives a little lower down in the rank of what moves members of Congress. They matter, don't get me wrong, they matter a lot, but I think that there are powerful cultural incentives now that also drive these members. Members of Congress are ambitious politicians. They want to succeed, they want to be prominent, they want to rise, they want fame, they want influence. And the question is, how do you get these things? Some of that is just about being elected and reelected, and that's hugely important. Electoral incentives surely are extremely powerful. There are also now, in our political culture, a set of incentives that drive people to treat the Congress as a performative arena, as a platform where you can show your voters that you're bringing the fight to the other side. And so if you attend just an average congressional hearing now, a lot of what you'd find are not members talking to each other or listening to a witness, but members talking to a camera and producing a YouTube clip that they're going to use later when running for re-election, or trying to get on Fox or MSNBC with just the right line that their voters are going to email to each other. And very often a committee hearing is very frustrating as a result of this, because members will just say the same thing as the last guy said, because he needs a video of himself saying it. Doesn't matter if the question was already asked. I think those kind of performative incentives should not be underestimated. They are now enormously important to how members understand their upward path. Part of that is because there's less for them to do legislatively, as we talked about. Spending time just getting to know the financial system for your committee work is not as worthwhile. That's a powerful incentive. Part of it is that this is what our political culture celebrates and rewards. It's how to get the attention of your voters. It is how to rise. And so I think alongside electoral incentives, you have these cultural incentives. Now, let me say a word about electoral incentives. I think it should never be underestimated how much the introduction of primaries in the 1970s transformed the culture of the Congress. And that's all about incentives. We've created a situation by now where the most significant concern that most members have in both parties is about a primary challenge. It's especially true in the House, but it's also true in the Senate. They have pretty safe seats. If you're the Republican and you're running in Missouri, you're probably going to win. Not necessarily, but probably. And surely, if you're running in Mississippi, or if you're the Democrat in Oregon, if you win that nomination, you're going to win the seat. But winning that nomination is where the real fight is had. And that means that the incentive you have is not to build a broad coalition, to build a big tent. It's to appeal to the most narrowly focused voters who are most likely to show up on primary day. And that, to me, is an argument for thinking about electoral reform, because the incentives that confront members of Congress should be incentives for broadening the tent, for reaching across party lines. The parties have that incentive. If you're the Republican Party and you've got to elect people both in Mississippi and in Delaware, you're going to want to build a broad tent. The Democratic Party is just the same way. But the individual member doesn't have that incentive. And I think we need to look for ways to better align the party and the individual incentive in such a way that there's a reason for members to try to reach persuadable voters and reach out to people who are not already intensely on their side. So I would look at those two kind of incentives, electoral and fundamentally cultural, in thinking about why Congress works the way it does.